This is an RNZ podcast.
29 and a bit to 10 is the time here on RNZ National. And we call that on a Wednesday night, Midweek Mediawatch o'clock here on nights. Colin Peacock is joining me now from a, comparatively calm and moderate Wellington. Kia ora, Colin.
Kia ora, Emil. I feel a bit bad about that now because I gave you a hard time. I did a couple of midweek media watches.
Oh, did you?
Ago. Yeah, because you at the start of your show you griped about, it was a bit wet and you had to take an umbrella, and it was the night that, I can't recall his name, but the 15-year-old Year 12 student ran the sub 4-minute mile in appalling conditions.
That's right, yes, I remember this, yes.
And I don't know why, I just gave you a hard time right at the start of the slot. It was a bit unpleasant.
You
you're
came,
the host and I'm just the.
You rolled in with violence, Colin, and I deserve it. I'm sure many people out there would agree.
It was just a bit mean and unnecessary. I don't know why I did it, but I'm sorry.
I'm sure that I deserved it in some way, shape or form. Bonnie's nodding enthusiastically, so there you go.
I can't take it back then. I didn't realise I had backup on that one.
How about you, Cole? I've been asking people throughout the evening, what's the best museum exhibition they've ever seen? This is because we're talking about Te Papa's Gallipoli exhibition after 10. How about you? What's the best museum exhibition, or the one that lives in your mind? I'm putting you on the spot here.
That really is a very good question. But on that, sorry, not answering a question now. It doesn't really help. I have never seen the giant Gallipoli.
Really?
No, even though I live in this town and,
Well, it's just been extended to 2032, Cole, so
but
you do have time.
In the 2015 centenary, I did go and see the other one that Peter Jackson had a major hand in, possibly the major hand in. I think the one at Te Papa was not so much his own work, but certainly he was involved with it and Weta. But the other one that was at the old, what people of my age think of it as the old museum, where we went on school trips. That's now part of Massey University, where the Carillon is and the memorial there. That exhibition was quite something. But at the time, to me, it felt like it was all a bit much. And I never went to see the big one with the oversized figurines. And yet so many people, and people from overseas who've come to visit me, have said the same as I heard you say, that they found it moving and confronting and fascinating. And weirdly, I've never seen it, even though it would cost me nothing. And I've been past the building hundreds and hundreds of times while it's been there. So what have I got? Another 7 years?
You've got another 7 years. So there's your homework, Colin. I'll give you some homework. It's due in 2032. On my desk, an essay, 400 words about what you learned through the Te Papa Gallipoli exhibition.
Second Wednesday in April 2032. Just putting it in the calendar now. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it.
It's there.
All right, let's talk some media. We'll start by talking about this Philip Polkinghorne documentary show. You've been watching this. Billed as the TV doco event of the year. Does Polk live up to the billing?
Well, in fact, 3, the channel, the broadcasters, Warner Brothers Discovery, they're billing it, in fact, as the documentary event of the year when I went back and checked, because that's in a slide that comes up in the trailer, because that did kind of register on both. So big call, it's only April for a start, and, they're not specifying New Zealand or anything. However, look, obviously it's just promotional stuff, but I mean, it was a bold call. They ran it Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and I can't recall the last time a local production, factual thing ran in quite that fashion. There will have been some, but it's less common, fewer of these programs being made in the current media climate. So big effort. Public money went into it as well. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But I guess it kind of depends what you're looking for in a documentary, because there's certainly a lot in this when you add up all together over the 3 nights. I must admit I haven't made it all the way to the end of the 3rd episode, but I definitely will. But for many people, it's going to be, I think if they do watch all through, it'll be the fullest account that they'll get of what happened, because, obviously so much written about it in the papers and online on websites. It was coming out every day, that was discussed in news bulletins. But most people, I don't think, would have followed all of the case through to the conclusion. So, but what it isn't, it really isn't a sort of all sides considered production. It's a bit opportunistic, and that sounds like a judgy word, but I think that's almost literally what it is, because it absolutely makes the most of 2 interviews with people who did not speak in the trial, right? And that's Philip Polkinghorne himself and his mistress, Madison Ashton, who is now not at all camera shy, and basically saying that she believes him to have been guilty of the murder. The other thing is that it's unusual as a documentary and a factual program, in that the private investigator, Julia Hartley-Moore, who has a media profile of her own, is the executive producer. She has her own production company, and she also sort of insisted on being part of the story, because quite early on she says that she thinks Pauline Hanna got in touch with her before she died, requesting her help, although she didn't give a name. Now, how likely it really is that this call she received was really Pauline Hanna? I mean, she's convinced of it, but it really wasn't explored. I mean, if they were going to make a big deal of it, I think they really should have nailed that one down, even if it took a bit of time out of the program, because over 3 hours they definitely could have done that. And I think while the makers have tried to give the message that it's a program that honours the life of Pauline Hanna, starts with her, ends with her, I don't really think it does that, and it's a bit off-putting in a factual program that Julia Hartley-Moore and Madison Ashton, both in business in their own ways, are kind of puffing themselves up, in this production, which, as I say, Julia Hartley-Moore herself had a big role in. And I think part of it is also that this has already been sold overseas, I understand.
Right.
And I think partly the way it's introduced, I think, I think you can see that it was done for that rather than just for the New Zealand audience.
Philip Polkinghorne has responded to the documentary. I think he gave a statement, didn't he, to stuff. He called it tabloid-style clickbait and claims he was deceived. Is that right?
Yes, he does. I mean, he gave a statement to stuff like you said, and it included messages between people involved with the production. His lawyers, I think, released the statement too, so they would have been over it. So he was clearly given the impression that it was going to be sympathetic to him, and at least the makers were sympathetic to him, and possibly not disputing the outcome of the trial itself, which was in his favour. But I mean, honestly, at the very least, you think he should have suspected he wasn't going to come out of it well. And as he says himself in this, look, I wasn't on trial for morality things here. This was about murder and the death of his wife, the murder trial and the death of his wife. And that's absolutely true. But I mean, in that case, why would you want to be interviewed when it was inevitable that all these other things that he's saying are irrelevant but are also, of interest? His, the drug use and the payments to Madison Ashton, all that stuff, and the lifestyle. If you've gone through the trial, it's been brought up in the media. Why would you go into it again in an interview? So he clearly thought it was going to be good for him. It clearly wasn't, and the program that came out obviously is not what he thought it was going to be. As from calling it tabloid, I think that's certainly fair, because although there's journalism kind of in it, the style is pretty tabloid. I'll give you an example. Lots of sort of annoying, intrusive soundtrack, slow-mo, sort of visual filler stuff. Here's a little bit of Philip Polkinghorne speaking himself about getting arrested.
I felt I should get a man to do it rather than a woman, because I felt like a guy like Polkinghorne didn't really respect women. So I got my Get guy.
I had no idea at all, because I'd never been arrested before, never been in a police station. And I was fingerprinted. They take your belt off you, your phone, your watch, your shoelaces, and leave you in a cell.
We played a bit of the wrong clip at the top there, didn't we?
Just
Carl?
at the start, we'll get back to that one. But the ending of the clip there, I know it's confusing, but if you were listening closely, it's kind of funny, because as Polkinghorne is talking there, he's saying, they put me in a cell, slamming a cell door. They take my belt, the sound of a belt being unfurled. I'd never been arrested for handcuffs. And I think there's a phenomenon, I think they call it Lord Privy Seal. I remember getting my broadcasting training, and they're saying, don't try to match every word the person says with a visual image of that thing. The classic joke was, Lord Privy Seal, law lord with a wig. And then a privy, meaning like an old wooden toilet, and then a seal, like
listen.
And they do this it's a sort of classic trope of old training, so don't try and be too literal with your images. And this really was. I mean, I'm being nitpicky here, and obviously it's the most important thing when this is all about someone's death, but the style of it, if you're talking tabloid, they really didn't go too imaginative with the way they dressed up Polkinghorne's interview, which, given that it was his only interview since the outcome of the that has been seen since the outcome of the trial. It was recorded before then. It could have stood on its own without all the embellishment.
Listen to this. The Lord Privy Seal BBC training. You're about to tell me, aren't you, that this should have been a more journalistic, straight-faced telling of the story, less entertainment-y, aren't you, Colin?
Well, yeah, actually, I think so. I think it still would have been a good program and wouldn't have not had less attraction for people who were keen on finding out more about it and more about the personalities involved. But this is the thing, like the balance of the journalism. I don't want to give the wrong idea that there is no journalism or factual content in it. It does set out areas of doubt in the case and the evidence that was stuff that was hard to understand or might have seemed damning. And there are journalists in it. In particular, the Herald's court reporter Craig Capitan is in it, and he's very credible. He's dropped in at points to describe. To almost hold up the play and say, no, the significant thing here is, or the thing we were all wondering, the thing that didn't seem to make sense at this point. And he does it very dispassionately. He's really, really useful to the documentary, and a very good advert for the Herald. They also drop in another Herald journalist, that's Chelsea Daniels, who these days I think fronts their front page daily podcast. And she sort of says out loud, the unanswered or unanswerable questions that arise, that so at this point we're wondering how could that possibly be, and why aren't the police looking at this? And that was a good way of punctuating it for people and making it easier to follow. So I don't want to be too unfair about the program, because they realised there's a lot of complicated information even for people who know the outcome of the trial and followed it in the news. So I thought they did do that pretty well. But that contrast, again, I know I've already griped about it, but Julia Hartley-Moore putting herself into it. So here, once again, is Julia Hartley-Moore talking about how she secured that interview with Philip Polkinghorne.
I felt I should get a man to do it rather than a woman, because I felt like a guy like Polkinghorne didn't really respect women. So I got my Get guy. He's a journalist. He can get anyone to talk.
Can you see that? Is that hidden all right?
I like how you wrote the ins and outs for that audio in the script, Colin, as ghastly soundtrack.
Ghastly or ghostly? Oh, no, it is ghastly. You're right. In fact, I think either would do. Yeah. I mean, the weird thing about that, what she was saying there, was that the journalist involved, she said, I got my Get guy to do this. It turned out to be TVNZ Sunday producer Chris Cook, formerly of that program. And as was reported over the weekend, when he was named, he had asked to be removed from the credits of the program, so possibly not that happy to be described as Julia Hartley-Moore's Get guy. But the story that emerged, and I think was published in the Stuff papers in the weekend, was that after that interview was done and the deal was done to bring on board the documentary maker Mark McNeil with Julia Hartley-Moore, they formed this joined identity, this I think it's called Blonde Razor Film Production, so a combination of their two corporate identities, and he was told he would no longer be required. So I don't think the whole thing kind of went entirely as planned to get to this point.
What have other critics made of this documentary on the whole?
It's been mixed, but a lot of people have pointed out those tabloid elements. On News Talk ZB, Heather Duplessis-Allen, the Drive host, is back after a long spell of maternity leave. She very enthusiastically spoke about that program on her first day back on Monday. Her words were, this is kind of almost an exact quote, to her, Polkinghorne did not exude honesty vibes. Right. In his interview. So that's her view, because obviously the outcome of the court case was what it was. Steve Braunius in the Herald, who went to the court case and wrote very colourfully about it, he said, look, it does all make for good tabloid TV. The ominous soundtrack, the drone footage, the mean streets of Remuera, which is how the thing is established in the first episode. And he says, look, this does all succeed, in his words, as a powerful character studies of the quite weird Polkinghorne and the even weirder, possibly, Madison Ashton, who is quite odd in the whole thing. And because she's so forthcoming, there's a lot of her across the 3 episodes. Yeah. But he makes a really good point in the Herald in his piece. He said it's interesting to compare this documentary, Polk, the trial of Philip Polkinghorne, with The Lie, the murder of Grace Mullane, which was, I think, about a year ago that one came out. He's saying those two murder trials were completely different, and so are the documentaries. The Lie was very darkly serious, and more carefully filmed, less of that sort of filler stuff that we talked about, slow motion, and all of that. And he says not entirely inappropriate to allow Madison Ashton these what he describes as her antic wit, because she really is quite unusual. But the main point he makes, both these documentaries, they take the side of the Crown, and not that much attempt made to present the other side of it, which is obviously what Philip Polkinghorne himself appears not to have expected, although Steve Brauness makes the point that, at least in doing that interview, he does have his say, as the documentary 3 parts unfold, he's in it.
You mentioned earlier on that there was public money involved with the making of this. I'm not sure how much, Colin, but I mean, I found that quite interesting. That this is a true crime documentary on the most notorious New Zealand court case in decades. In this media environment where true crime really sells, it is surely as slam dunk a project as you're going to get in terms of the ability to attract big audiences and ability to monetize. And surely commercial broadcasters are businesses. There has to be an element of risk reward when you're commissioning programs, right? Why did public money go into making this?
Yeah, it's hard to see the public value in it. It'd be kind of interesting to see the pitch documents, I guess, but it wasn't a huge, I think, I haven't looked this up, but my head tells me it was, I think, $280,000. I think certainly less than $300,000. Not an insignificant sum of money, but if
not that much in terms of a big
3 hours of primetime telly that did involve outside work and not just people in a courtroom and chopping up existing footage. So maybe it was the case that to get it over the line, and this helps the industry. Not everything has to be about the public value of a program necessarily. So it could be that and then a larger contribution from the producers was enough, and they would see it as appropriate. Also, the fact that it's I believe already been arranged for sale and broadcast overseas, and you can just see this being dropped into crime and punishment channels on various national broadcasting networks and streaming services. This weird story from New Zealand about these odd characters and sex, drugs, money. All of that, so you can see how that was. So maybe they thought in terms of, investing in something that was, an investment rather, financial rather than, the public value in it. But when you've seen other programs where they've been criticised as, why on earth did public money go into that? A classic case some years back, the GC, you know that? And the pitch documents are very much about, the cultural ties and anguish of young New Zealanders who move across chasing the dream on the Gold Coast and then find themselves away from their whakapapa and so on and all of that. And then when the program came out, at least in the first couple of episodes, it really wasn't a lot of cultural significant stuff in there, and it did appear to have been cast.
I think it is considered
with appearance in mind when they got to it. But they retrofitted some elements of it, and I think the last series, they explored concepts of fungi and relationships and stuff like that, and there was a little more of that cultural content that was unique that they could point to. But in this case, I think hard to make a case that public money was needed to get something that clearly was clickbait might be too strong, but a heavily clicked upon and engaged with story when it was actually in the courts in the first place. It
is, I think, a skill in and of itself to write pitch documents. I've heard that from several people, actually. Right, let's talk about this Trust in Media report. You dedicated a lot of Sunday's Mediawatch to this. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, actually, to listen to that. This report is an annual thing. It comes from AUT, Trust in News. And this year's iteration found the decline in trust, which had been precipitous for many years, had stalled. What was the reaction to that, Colin?
One, DB Thompson wrote into us at Mediawatch to say, with the RNZ headline on this was, is the free fall in trust over? He just said, nope, kind regards. So,
to the point.
Blunt there, yeah. And that was the tone of it. People who took the time to write to Mediawatch wanted to say, no, we don't trust it. And there was one finding in there that was interesting, was that the older groups, will say 55 and over, between, I think, 55 and 74, these groups recorded higher levels of mistrust and sort of perhaps disappointment in the media than younger groups, which was a surprise, because you'd think those are the groups more likely to subscribe and pay and have done so over a measure of time. So the survey authors thought that possibly these people had a concept of the media as it used to be.
Or
and
maybe
felt,
the closer you're looking, the more it's like looking at the lines on your hand, and the longer that you steer, the more that you spot.
Yeah, could be something like that. And as Greg Treadwell, one of the AUT folks in charge of the survey, said, maybe younger people kind of don't know what the media used to be, but the older ones who do have a sense of that feel they're not getting, and things were cited like there's not enough international reporting and, things like, so maybe they felt perhaps let down rather than mistrust of the media might be too strong. Who knows? But so, but I did get a couple of letters from this. So one listener called Brendan said, look, I'm older and more sceptical. He said this was also a fairly common theme of those who took the trouble to write. It's difficult to see your own bias when your bias is shared by your friends and colleagues. Journalists are overwhelmingly left of centre, says Brendan, and this dominates the lens through which events are chosen. So this is a fairly common view, and that could lead to mistrust clearly. But also echoing that other theme of what's missing is Brendan says there's an absence of long-form, thoughtful articles. This is a glaring gap that's now being filled by Substack, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Brendan is clearly engaging with new media ways of doing that, not just, griping about what's not in the newspaper or something like that. And he said media really need to raise readership. They need to address these things and get people to trust them. Another person said, took issue with me saying, look, the survey slump has become a stick used by foes of the media to beat them with, which I only meant to use that in conjunction with the people who, sometimes the media is used as evidence of what people already thought about the media, whereas the media themselves, to get a high trust score, will say, look, this backs us up. We are trustworthy. Look at the scores. So just saying the results get used by people who feel both of these things. Yeah. But one listener got in touch to say, look, you're framing the issue weirdly. Are you saying that people who hold that view are foes? The statement's very defensive, positioning media as a victim rather than the media being rightly subject to scrutiny. So I think that's sort of showing that, he says trust issues arise from story selection, unrelenting bias in favour of progressive viewpoints. So it's still that concept that journalists can't see their own bias, do lean left, and that they really notice it. It's something that needs to be balanced up. That's something that's, I think, pretty hard to shift. And the telling thing to me was when they asked people in that survey to rate the trustworthiness of each individual outlet, every single one, whether it was a local one like the Otago Daily Times or a national outfit like RNZ or TVNZ, there was not less than 20% of each say, no, don't trust it. So there is this kind of base level right across the media, whatever it is. So probably a problem with journalism rather than actual media outlets.
I was really interested in a comment that you got, which might also have been from Brendan, as a matter of fact, who was talking about COVID reporting and the effect that COVID reporting had perhaps on media credibility. And I think Brendan said something like, the media was just a megaphone for the government and for Big Pharma, and some reputational damage has kind of been done here.
I think an apology, an acknowledgement and apology would actually go some way to repairing the damage. Whereas, the media people feel this is kind of misconception. In fact, Greg Treadwell of the AUT did speak about this in, what ended up being quite a long interview. He was saying that, this was really unfair in the media in his view, because when you have a national crisis and the role of the media does change, it doesn't mean that you're going to abandon impartiality and not question anything, but it just does happen. When there is emergency information that needs to be conveyed, it's got to be done, and some people are inevitably going to see the means, like our civil defence and emergency management legislation requires that in the event of a natural disaster, which obviously this wasn't. So I don't think people would react the same way about Cyclone Gabrielle if the media was simply relaying, information from authorities of state, and emergency management. But they did, in this case, because it was political decisions being made and announced every day and relayed by the government. But that was the kind of public information function of the media, which it does have. And, there's the likes of, say, Michael Morrow, who did scrutinise government statements and performance and did go back and get them to justify and respond to things that had been said 3 days earlier. He'd be pulling his hair out to hear people think that did not happen.
Yeah, I mean, we had an interview on the program yesterday. Sorry, I know that we do have other topics to get to and running out of time, but I interviewed Peter Cox yesterday about his book about the New Zealand journalist Douglas Brass, who was famed for his war reporting. And, I wonder whether some of those sort of things were way better back in the day type folks. may have looked at the war, the reporting that came out of, for example, the Second World War, which is, again, an example of a national and international crisis, which is open-ended. No one knows how it's going to finish, right? And these reports are written at the time where there is this, the unknown. We are all sort of venturing into the unknown. And Peter talked about how fascinating it was reading through these things because of the tensions that you can see cropping up in this war reporting between, reporting the truth of what's happening. There is a fear of government censorship of what you're writing. There is perhaps a duty of societal, of obligation on the journalist to sort of preserve societal harmony and keep morale high. Maybe COVID is different to war, obviously, in many different ways, but I thought that was quite interesting, the media's role in times of open-ended crisis.
Yeah, it partly boils down to what you think people's expectations are in the individual circumstances and what their crisis is. There's Ian F. Grant wrote this epic, well, it's a 2-volume history of New Zealand newspapers from 1840 all the way up to year 2000. And the second volume covered World War II. Papers shrank in New Zealand because they couldn't get paper to print on.
Yeah.
But, he was saying that, the audiences were maybe more understanding back then, and they would understand that news couldn't be up to the minute, and certain things about the movement of troops, they didn't kind of expect that there would be dispassionate or unpropagandized, if that's a word, accounts, because, that they simply didn't expect it, or they might have had a concept of the national interest, and if it had been queried and questioned too much by newspapers, it would have been a problem. So whether the audience has that expectation now in an age of social media and disintermediated information spread and all that stuff, it probably would never go back to what it used to be 100 years ago.
Let's spend the last couple of minutes talking about lobbying. You spoke last month to Dr. Bryce Edwards of the newly formed Integrity Institute, and he's been on a crusade, I see, for more disclosure on lobbying. Any developments there? Yeah,
he has. In fact, now published online what he calls the New Zealand Lobbying and Influence Register.
Yeah.
So how he describes it is a living repository of constantly updated and improved information, partly crowdsourced. So the first entries are just drafts, but they'll contain information that still needs to be verified and tested. Quite interesting. He says some of it's been researched with the help of AI, interestingly, and errors will naturally need fixing, so let us know. So he's often talked about, influence in the shadows, right? But what he's actually done here is list all the lobbying firms that he knows of and tried to give as much information about that. And we know he's already suspicious and maybe a bit resentful of the connections that exist between hundreds of people, politicians, institutions, businesses, and the clients of these lobbying firms who, make quite a decent living off it in some cases. And that's what he wants to bring to life in a kind of searchable register that anyone can look at. He thinks the law should have already done this, so that's why he's doing it.
And he is talking about professional lobbying here, because I suppose, a thing that you hear a lot about this is, people present lobbying as this sort of villainous thing that happens in the shadows, but lobbying is the ability to lobby is fundamental to democracies, right? Going and saying something to your local MP about something that you would like to see changed is, in the purest sense of the word, lobbying.
Yes, of course it is. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And they would argue that this levels the playing field as well, because if you didn't have some sort of medium whereby places that are not well represented in the parliament or geographic locations or whatever, it gives them an opportunity, if they've got the means, to be able to get the sort of access that other groups can get that may not have to pay for it. They may already have those connections to former politicians, so it can change the picture. That's certainly part of it. But the way the information's presented is fascinating. You can go in and look at all these different PR firms and companies that they've listed, the Integrity Institute, 25 separate categories, all the corporate details, names, staff, leadership, all of that. And then it gets down to the clients represented. And picking one, for example, really briefly, Blackland PR, loads and loads of clients, Provincial Rugby Union, Sea Lord, all of that. New Zealand Film Commission, an agency of state that's relatively modestly funded, all the way down to the Hutt Voluntary Heritage Group. So it's quite interesting to work out who ends up engaging with these big companies and who doesn't, because they're not all the major clients who are, intent on wielding great power.
Perhaps quite a few names that you would see crop up on media programs as well.
That's right, yes, and finding out who they have represented in the past. It's very interesting.
Interesting stuff. Colin, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.